Hey! This channel just passed 2 pretty cool milestones. It's been around for over a year and it just reached 500 subscribers. That's super sick. I just wanted to open by thanking all of you who watch my videos and who take the time to like and comment. It's really awesome to see this little community grow little by little. Now to celebrate, I thought I would do something a little different this time around and review one of my own comics. It's been a few years since I completed this one, and looking back on it, I definitely did do some stuff right, but I also did some things pretty poorly. So let's look at my own webcomic, Dreads. Before we get started though, I'd like to welcome you to MangAnalysis, where I do little reviews of the manga I've been reading. If you like what you see and would like to see more, make sure to subscribe and leave a like, maybe even leave a comment. Let's get a conversation going. Okay, so I just want to clarify some things before I get too deep into it. This comic is not the one I was working on a few weeks ago. That one is called Blackfish and it's entirely different, and I'll put a link in the description below. I also have another webcomic that just released not long ago, also called Fire, which I've been working on with a friend for like 6 years. Its release is kind of a big deal. There's also a link below if you want to check that one out. Finally, there will be spoilers for my comic Dreads in this video, but if I'm honest with you, there aren't a ton of plot twists or deep narrative or anything really worth worrying over. So yeah, if anything, it might be funnier to read Dreads after watching this video, because you'll be like, so that's what he meant by horrible planning. I get it. Okay, so what is Dreads about? Dreads is basically what happens when someone really likes a quiet place, stand still, stay silent, and the road. It takes place in a post-apocalyptic world where monsters known as Dreads have appeared and brought the human race to the brink of extinction. Our protagonist is a lone traveler who one day stumbles upon a little cat. He's so desperate for companionship that he follows the cat in all sorts of trouble. Dun dun dun. So yeah, there's more to it, but that's essentially it. It's a survival horror thriller, and there's a cute cat, and you know what? That's all you should really need to have a good, compelling story. It all started when I thought I could do a whole comic in 24 hours for some challenge. I literally took like 20 minutes, thought of the first plot that came to mind, wrote a super quick outline, and went at it. It took me more than 24 hours. It took like 2 to 3 weeks for the first chapter. And then once it was done, I released it on webtoons. It didn't go viral or anything, but at the end of my first chapter, I had about 500 readers or so, and there was some interest in continuation. So I continued it. 6 chapters later, I was done with the whole thing. I had about 5.5 thousand readers and 250,000 views. Honestly, looking back, still feels kind of surreal. It was my first time doing anything like this on my own, and while I did some pretty cool things, I also made some pretty big mistakes, and I'd like to share some of those with you today. If you're someone who's interested in getting into comics, I suggest learning from my mistakes so you won't have to do them yourself. So the first big mistake I made making this comic was that there was no planning whatsoever, like at all, which is absolutely whack. When I was coming up with the plot, I knew it had to be something I could do fast because, don't forget, I wanted to do this in 24 hours, which is stupid. So I made a rough outline with no dialogue and some really rough thumbnails. I then inked and colored everything and then decided to add dialogue based on what I drew, which is super backwards. Typically, you start with an outline, and then you write a script, then you do thumbnails with your text, and then you go and do the art. Not only did I do things backwards, I did everything kind of poorly. My outline was bare bones, my thumbnails were way too loose to build from, and my text was very cringy. Then, I decided to extend the comic. You'd figure I would have learnt my lesson and planned the next chapters out. Nuh-uh. I did the exact same thing, and I suffered the entire time. I planned a rough outline for chapter 2, sketched out some thumbnails for my pages, and went to town with the inking. The only thing worse this time is that I was releasing pages weekly as opposed to having an entire chapter of buffer written out. So I was literally writing as I went. It was really stressful, it made my pacing rubbish, it made my dialogue weak, and it made any attempts at character development incredibly difficult, and it meant that I was constantly going back to previous pages to make sure I wasn't writing plot holes. Plot twists, there are tons of plot holes. To be fair though, I was able to fix a fair amount of them in the remastered version of the comic, but still. The amount of times I would draw a facial expression and then have to write around it just so I didn't have to redraw it was absolute madness. Like, who does that? I draw my character angry, but the story sort of necessitated a surprise face, and then instead of taking the 10 minutes to redraw the face, I do all these literary gymnastics to change the narrative to fit the art. It makes absolutely no sense. All to say, when you're creating your comic, take the time to plan it out properly. Make sure you get your outline done, make sure you write a script, make sure your thumbnails make sense, and then you can go ahead with the art. The second thing I did really poorly was my dialogue. Okay, so like I mentioned earlier, my entire narrative journey through Dreads was whack and nonsensical. Of course the dialogue suffered. However, it was so much worse because, just like from the get-go, my dialogue is usually pretty cringe, so I really did shoot myself in the foot there. My problem is I write like I speak, which works for maybe one character, but not for an entire cast. Dialogue and speech mannerism is really important when it comes time to flesh out a character. Each person speaks differently, and showing that in dialogue is a really useful way to make a character feel more real. Now, when all your characters talk the same, and like the same as me, specifically, it's going to be bad. Thankfully, I had a good friend of mine edit and help me rewrite the entire script for my remastered release, and I think it really helped. I'm not going to beat this horse too much since it's essentially an extension of the first point, but remember, if you're creating characters, their speech is just as important as their design. In fact, it goes hand in hand. Thought out speech can really make the difference between a character that feels flat versus one that feels fleshed out. Okay, so I just roasted myself pretty bad there, and you know what? It was absolutely well deserved. But I do think I did a few things right. And the first one, the thing I think I nailed the most, is the atmosphere. I think I was truly able to capture the sense of dread, see what I did there, I was going for. And how did I achieve it? Mostly with the color palette. That pink is really sort of unsettling, I think. It's in a weird limbo between being warm and cold, and it makes the sky forever feel gloomy and treacherous. Adding all the heavy blacks in there also helps make the art feel heavy, like a slow-moving crawl. I knew with this comic that I'd be rushing throughout most of it, so a limited palette was a must. Not gonna lie though, falling on that pink was more luck than a ton of forethought, but I knew I had something as soon as I was done with the first page. There's absolutely nothing wrong with using limited palettes, just make sure that what you choose matches what you're going for. A timeless example is sepia tones to indicate age. Lots of people will use sepia to tell a story that might have happened long ago. A black and white palette with huge emphasis on the black makes for wonderful noir stories. Limited palettes are wonderful because, well, they're limited and don't really offer tons of room for error, but if used properly can also add tons of atmosphere to your piece, and I think Dreads demonstrates that quite well. The other thing I think I did quite well was the transition from chapter 1 to 2. Now, like I mentioned before, I had no idea where I was going with this story and my planning was atrocious, but it did give me the opportunity to start fresh for the second chapter. See, the first chapter ends pretty well. It could for sure have been a self-contained story. So with the second chapter, we jump right into a flashback of another character entirely. You don't know who she is, you don't really know what she has to do with the first character, you know pretty much nothing. I remember having readers comment things like, ooh, who's that? Or whoa, is each chapter going to have a new character? Which was really fun. I was sort of able to set myself up for some expectation subversion there. I had a solid 30 pages where readers didn't know what to expect, which worked in my favor. At the end, you see how this character's story fits into the first chapter, but the initial mystery was, in my opinion, really effective. I also sort of changed the narrative style where the second chapter had a lot more dialogue and exposition than the first one. Again, hinting that this could be just another self-contained chapter. All in all, while my narrative wasn't the best, I think this transition really gave me the confidence to continue with this series for longer than originally anticipated. Well, that's essentially what I had to say about my own comic, Dreads. It was my first time showing a comic online and it was a wonderful experience. It taught me to stick to deadlines, especially the weekly thing, which is something I'm still trying to do with this channel. It taught me that I had tons to learn about making comics. It taught me the importance of planning, but it also made me a much better draftsman. There's tons of things I drew in that comic that I probably never would have drawn before, like a wheelchair. I don't know in what other context I would have drawn that, but I actually had to draw quite a few for this comic. I always struggled with interior spaces, but I had to draw a fair amount of those and eventually got pretty okay at drawing them. So yeah, despite many fumbles along the way, I think I was able to create a pretty fun little comic. And if any of you are interested in checking it out, I'll leave the link in the description below. Just make sure that you read the remastered version of the 6 chapters. There should be at the top of the list. However, once finished those, rereading the thing from the beginning could be fun because you'll see the changes that I made, and hopefully you'll agree that those changes were for the best. Well, that was me reviewing my own comic. Now, what about you? Are there any cool webcomics out there that you feel I should be made aware of? Have you maybe even written one yourself? If so, drop a link. I'd love to read it. Again, I'd like to thank you all for 500 subscribers. Another huge thanks to all of you who like and comment on my videos. It really does mean a lot. I hope you liked this video, and if you did indeed enjoy it, consider subscribing. This was MangAnalysis, and I'll see you in the next one.